Okay, I leave you the word now.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint, and I'm hoping that you will be able to, that I will be able to follow the chat. So I'm just going to share, no, not that one, this one, share screen, and start on the first slide. And so my name is Anne Fox. I'm British and French, and I am based in Denmark. I teach English, I teach intercultural training. I do a podcast called Absolutely Intercultural, and that has been going since 2006, and we have even won a couple of awards for it. And the podcast was started as the end product of a project that we did under the European Union, and it ended in 2006. So the project was about preparing or creating a set of tools and help for teachers of adults all over the world, but primarily aimed at Europeans, to make their classrooms more culturally responsive. Now then, a lot has happened since 2006. So this webinar is called Culturally Responsive Training, Why and How. And basically, what's happened in the 10 years or so since we ended our project is that there's been a lot going on in the US under the name Culturally Responsive Teaching. And what I want to do is I want to present a little bit of what that involves, what that entails, and to see if it has any relevance to intercultural training. So culturally responsive training is not something that you can Google, or at least it shouldn't be, because the correct expression is culturally responsive teaching. And I just want to use this session to have a look at what culturally responsive teaching is and to try and tease out what, how it might help in intercultural training. Now then, I am freelance. I run my own company, which is Anne Fox APS in Denmark. I do have a website. It's annefox.eu, but at the moment it's not working, so don't go there. But I am online in many other places, such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, and so on. So it is possible to get hold of me. Right, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, this is the map, the road map of what I hope to do. I hope that this will take about maybe 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be the opportunity to ask questions. But I had also intended to ask a few questions along the way, to see if what I'm presenting has any resonance with what you've met in your intercultural training. I'll present a couple of the main tools that are used in culturally responsive teaching, and then try and tease out some of the benefits which I think might cross over to intercultural training. So let's first of all look at, just look at my notes here, look at what happens with culturally responsive teaching. Basically what it's all about, what it comes down to, is how do you make a diverse group of people feel comfortable, welcome, and valued? And this is what it relates to. There are many aspects to it, but that is a sort of summary of what we're trying to achieve. And I think that a common misconception when people talk about culturally responsive teaching is that it's about having a few images in the training room that relate to the cultures where the people in the room come from, but it's actually much more than that. And if I go to the next one, it isn't about intercultural training. But what I want to do is I want to try and give you a flavour of what it is, and then tease out what aspects can be thought of as useful for intercultural training purposes. So, culturally responsive teaching, that phrase actually is used very much in the US. So it's not something that we had met when we were doing our project that ended in 2006. It's been going for quite a while in the US, and it's aimed mainly at K-12. So that means it's aimed mainly at school children. It's aimed mainly at the American school classroom, which, as you can imagine, is quite diverse. And so one of the questions is, well, there are three main questions. Will something that is developed in the US travel? Will something that's developed for school children travel, for example, to the adult training? Finally, I've forgotten what the third one is, but it'll come back to me. The main emphasis when you're looking at culturally responsive teaching is a focus on the instructor. So knowing that this is about school, no, it's a focus on the teacher. And there is very much one of the main responsibilities of a culturally responsive teacher is to be self-aware. Now that, I think, is very easily understandable for intercultural trainers. So that's something which they spend a lot of time on, is trying to make teachers more self-aware so that they can be more inclusive in their teaching. One of the things that I've noticed when I've been doing research and trying to use or see how much I can use of the American materials is that almost inevitably there's a huge focus on race and the issue of race, because that's a very hot button issue in the US. And so I think that that was my third point, that the culturally responsive teaching is very much focused on how to make sure that people of all races, children of all races, feel included in the classroom. So in Europe, although race is an issue, it's not as much of an issue as it is in the US. And maybe we are more talking about multicultural teams, we're more talking about, maybe in the light of the last 12 months, we're more talking about including migrants and refugees. So the focus is probably a little bit different. So my question is, could we refer to culturally responsive training? I see a comment here. I am able to see the comments, so that's great. I was triggered by the term culturally curious. I would very much appreciate it if you could write more about that, because am I using the terms interchangeably? I'm just wondering if that's the issue. So I'm now going to go through, I said a couple, it's going to be about 5 different tools, which I think they're very much used in culturally responsive teaching, and I wonder if they would have some sort of crossover. So the first thing is actually something which is aimed at adults, and that has been created by Wlodkowski, which is a framework. And I think that maybe when you see the 4 elements of this framework, you probably recognize it. It probably makes sense to you. But I think it's helpful to actually make explicit something which you might operate on at a subconscious level. So the framework by Wlodkowski is actually aimed at adults. So here, we're not talking about children. He was working with adults, and he came up with a suggestion for how to make adults feel comfortable in training. And he came up with this framework, which comprises 4 different elements. First of all, establishing inclusion. And I guess this is where the most likely, this is the reference to intercultural differences here, establishing inclusion. He then talks about developing a positive attitude. And this is very schooly, if I can put it like that, because this is about creating a positive learning culture. But on the other hand, many of the training courses that adults go on, they are sent, and so they may not be the most positively motivated, and so we have to bear that in mind. In fact, I've just started with a group that I'm doing an online course with, and I note that 3 of them introduced themselves by saying that I was told to do this course. So I know that I'm going to have to work extra hard to make sure that they're motivated. So I think that this developing a positive attitude is something that applies equally to children and to adults. The enhancing meaning is about making sure that the tasks that you give people relate to their context, so that they feel that it's important to do the tasks that you're giving them. And obviously in the school setting, this is incredibly important because in the past, school tasks have been very much distanced from the real world, if I can put it like that. Whereas in adult education, and certainly in vocational training, I think we do make more of an effort to link what we're doing with the so-called real world. And then finally, which is really important for adults, is making sure that people become more competent when they leave than when they arrived. So engendering competence is the 4th one. So Wlodkowski calls this the motivational framework for culturally responsive teaching. And basically, I'm looking on the left-hand side now. This is about respecting different individual cultures, and works at the same time to create a common culture in the learning situation that all adults can accept. And I highlighted adults because this is an indication that this has some value to our work. So now I'm looking at the text chat where Tony van der Ven has expanded on his question about culturally versus interculturally. Curious about the use of the more inclusive term cultural. Oh, I see. Okay, as opposed to intercultural. Okay. I'm not here to defend the differences, but you can see from the framework that I've just been through that this is, on the one hand, all about fostering a common culture in the training room or in the classroom. So this is one tool which I think is quite useful, just as a thought experiment, if not on a practical level. And if I go then to the next tool, I'm sure that this is something that you recognize and that a lot of people use in intercultural training, which is the participation guide, where you set out at the beginning. I hope that you can still hear me because it's telling me that my internet is unstable. I'm sure that you say at the beginning that you set out what the expectations are regarding participation, and that I don't suppose that this list will have very much that's new in it. And again, it's something that maybe you take for granted, and maybe sometimes you forget to make this explicit, I don't know. But it's very important that people know where they are and that they're not put in a situation where they stumble without realizing that they're breaking some sort of rule or going over some sort of line. Because it's the intercultural classroom or the culturally responsive classroom, it's about listening very carefully. And I'm sure that you as trainers do this, but we have to try and instill our learners and our trainees to do this too. Keeping personal information shared confidential, that's, I think, is something that's very important for people to know. Speaking from your own experience, saying I think or in my experience rather than people say or we believe. This is the next one that is very difficult for people to keep to, I think. Do no blaming or scapegoating. Or maybe I'm doing it. I should say I find that difficult. I try very hard not to. And then avoiding generalizing about groups of people. Share airtime, that means giving everybody an equal amount of time to speak or the equal opportunity to speak, and focusing. How can you not generalize talking about groups? I think it depends on the task in hand. I think there are probably degrees of generalization, and some people in your group maybe can generalize too much. So maybe you can use this rule as a way of getting them back on track, and simply challenging people, saying, are you sure that's true about everybody in human resources, or whatever it is that they said. So I think the participation guide is probably something that's pretty familiar to most people. One thing that I find very interesting in the literature on culturally responsive teaching is about communication strategies. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Communication strategies, there's a lot been done about this. And when I say the starting point is the formalized ritual of a traditional classroom, I mean that's what we are comparing it to. Any examples for share airtime? This is just the American way of putting it, but it's basically to make sure that certain people don't dominate the discussion. It's also about giving the quiet people permission to speak by actually formalizing it. I think that for quiet people, for shy people, for people who come from cultures where it's not the done thing to speak up in meetings, especially if there's somebody in authority in charge of the meeting, and certainly the teacher would be regarded as in authority. I think that people with those backgrounds or with that psychological background need permission. They need a formal signal that, yes, we expect you to speak. Yes, we want you to speak. And yes, please, now is the time for you to speak. And so, I mean, this is all about communication. And as I say, when the main writers on culturally responsive teaching talk about communication, their point of reference is what we probably see of as a fairly stereotyped view of the school classroom, with a teacher in charge, talking most of the time exactly like I'm doing at the moment, where the students only speak if they're asked to, and they speak in an academic way. They're required to speak in an academic, using academic language. And I'm not saying that the things that are listed here would all be relevant, but for example, in the American context, they've made a distinction between what they call passive receptive, which would be the traditional classroom type of communication, versus participatory interactive way of communicating. And there they highlight specifically that Latino and African American and Native Hawaiian students would be tending very much more to the participatory, interactive form of communication. But that, of course, can be interpreted as rude, inconsiderate, because you're speaking over other people, speaking out of turn, and disruptive. But what the teachers are being asked to consider is that this is the expected way of communicating in the students' homes, and therefore we have to try and accommodate that in the classroom. So whether that travels to the adult European context, I'm not so sure. They also identify a communication strategy which is called call response, which is about responding as somebody is speaking. It's a shame that you haven't all got your microphone switched on, because at this point, I think the best analogy would be if you thought of African-American church service, where you have the pastor who's giving his sermon, and then the congregation is responding, saying, yeah, amen, hallelujah, and that sort of thing. This sort of call response way of communicating is, again, something which doesn't go down well in the traditional classroom. So it's a yeah, thank you, George. Yeah, so this is another thing that they need to take into account. Also, the way people explain things in the classroom is very much deductive, didactic. You explain. Whereas in some cultures, it's much more of an inductive way of communicating. In school, we tend to be topic-centered, with trying to adopt a linear logic. Whereas in other cultures, it would be what they call topic chained. So you illustrate something by telling a series of stories, and then the logic of it isn't apparent until the end. So you might think that it's off topic, but it's actually not. And I've just used one word there, metaphor, but it's actually very important. And the fact that metaphor can be much more important in some cultures than others, and you will communicate much better if you use metaphor, or if you are able to respond to metaphor. And of course, that leads to story as a way of imparting information, and also as a way of showing what you've learned. So basically what we're listing here is different types of communication strategies, which maybe don't fit in the normal business context necessarily, but maybe we should be a little bit ready to play around with communication, different types of communication. I saw a wonderful video. It was part of an American series about language, actually, and it was about a initiative, I think it was in California, to try and get African-American students to learn the academic language they need for success in school by treating their own way of speaking as a second language. So both languages were given equal status, and the strategy, the approach used in the classroom was translating, basically. How do we say that in academic English? How do we say that at home? So it was giving, instead of telling the students off for not speaking properly, it was giving them a sense of the way that they spoke was equally worthy, and that they just needed a different strategy when they were in school. So communication is very important. And the fourth tool is something called cooperative learning, which has worked extremely well in Denmark with migrant classes, in fact. I mean, again, this is something that was developed for the school context. And it basically revolves around giving people tasks, working in small groups of 4 to 6 people. The important thing is that you assign roles to each member of the group. And the roles are not you do task 1, you do task 2, and you do task 3, which is the default. Most people, when they get a big project and they have to do it in a group, they just divide it up into tasks. And it's very, very important to assign roles rather than tasks. And some of the roles are suggested here. For example, you could have a resource finder, a timekeeper, a consensus builder, a reporter, and so on. And the point about these is that the roles are rotated. So next time the group works together, you don't have somebody who falls into the role always of being the reporter because they're good at writing or they're good at making PowerPoints. What you do is that you rotate the roles. In the school context, it's to give everybody the different skills. But in the adult context, it's to show that everybody actually has those skills. And so you're stretching people to do these roles, even though they may not think that they're that good at them. So this rotation of the roles is a very important part of this cooperative learning. And you give people a joint task. I've put this is an essential question. This has a specific meaning in American educational circles. An essential question is an interesting question which you don't know the answer to. So an essential question is not what is the capital of Colombia. An essential question is it correct that Colombia is the happiest country on earth? That's an essential question because it's a question which you can't Google. That's another way of looking at it. There are questions that you can't Google. And it's very important that you have these sorts of tasks that you give to people, because then there's something for them to get their teeth into, and there's some chance of actually promoting interest and maintaining motivation. One of the essential parts then is also at the end to make sure that the groups present to the other groups. They show what they've done. So this is an important part of it, that you show your work. And the trainer has a very important role, which is not getting people out of trouble, but it's about identifying those groups that are struggling and maybe suggesting tools to solve the problems, but then walking away and trying to get the group to solve their own problems. And so that's the essence of cooperative learning. As I say, it was originated for schools, but we have used it here in Denmark, and it's worked incredibly well. It works very well with adults. It works very well with groups that are very diverse, and it works very well with diverse cultures. And this is, again, it's about formalizing and giving permission to people to do things which they may not be prepared to do because of their cultural background. So it formalizes it. And if I go to the very last tool, this is from a wonderful book that came out in 2015, and it is called Culturally Responsive Teaching. I don't know if that's coming out back to front, and it's by somebody called Zaretta Hammond, and she's very much school-based. She's very keen on linking what works to what's been found out in neuroscience, so it's very much linked to scientific principles. So here, the brown box, you can see that her definition of culturally responsive teaching is that it emphasizes cultural ways of learning. So what she's saying is that there are different ways of learning in different cultures, and cognition. And I've emphasized the cognition because that's her emphasis on the neuroscience, rather than focusing on cosmetic race-related displays. So this is the sort of default reaction when you tell a teacher who hasn't been prepared, you know, how can you make your classroom culturally responsive? You put up a few posters. So Hammond is talking about recognizing and affirming students' cultural roots, through incorporating deep cultural values and cultural ways of learning, using the memory systems of the brain, organizing around social interaction, and combining oratory skills with academic talk. And this social interaction, collectivism, is very important in Hammond's book. And that's because she's from the US, which has the very high individualism score. And what she's telling teachers is try a little bit more of collectivist work, try getting students to work together more and not making them individually responsible all the time. So she makes a very strong case for using more of the sort of social and collectivist ways of working rather than always this emphasis on individualism. So again, this may be through the American lens. And the other important one is the combining oratory skills with academic talk, which reflects a little bit what I was saying before about the different communication skills. And you will find, you'll see that on my last or penultimate slide, I have put the name of the book and the author, so you will see that. And one of the things that she advises is simply observing what you see, in her case in the classroom, but in your case maybe think of what goes on in the training room. What do you see? So again, back to those participation guidelines. Can you see them being used? The working together. Are you seeing evidence of people working together? Is there a spirit of inquiry? Is it an intellectually safe environment? And I like this. She's also saying, what do you hear? Using music, for example. Authentic discussion. This refers to not having an academic or theoretical discussion, but discussing a problem that is of direct relevance to the people in the room. I would think that was far easier in the training room than it is in the classroom. Everybody contributes, so we're back to this, who has permission to talk. Authentic feedback, which is reacting to the content rather than behavior. And then cultural modeling. For example, the teacher makes extensive use of metaphors. The teacher makes use of storytelling and so on. So those are 5 what I have called tools that I think might cross over quite well into the intercultural training room. And I don't know whether you agree or whether some of them seem more useful than others. So go to the next one.
Anne,
I'm wondering if the chat is in the way.
Yes. Can you repeat the book's title?
Yeah, the title is, it's actually very long, but the short title is Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. That's the short title. That's it. And then there's a subtitle which is Promoting Authentic Engagement and Rigor among Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students. So it's a very long subtitle, and I've put it on the last slides. When incorporating deep cultural values of learners, what would be my recommendation in case of big diversity of values in the group? I don't have a magic wand for that. But what I would say is that a lot of the difficulties that you might encounter can be minimized, if not reduced completely, I don't know, but certainly minimized by trying to make things explicit and transparent at the beginning. This is why the participation guidelines are so useful. This is why the framework is useful. This is why the roles in the cooperative learning is useful. Yeah, I don't know which values you were thinking of. I guess one of the obvious ones is about, for example, in Asian cultures where the teacher is the authority figure and can't be contradicted. That's going to be quite tough to get over. But I think there is a big value in trying to make these things explicit and transparent and obvious at the beginning so that people know what's expected of them. Oh, thank you so much, Nikki, for the book title. As I say, it will come up. Yeah, so what can be transferred? I think that the Wlodkowski framework of inclusion, positive learning environment, meaningful tasks, and raising competence, certainly something that are useful to keep in mind. Something that they talk about a lot in the literature on CRT is avoiding stereotype, threat, and microaggressions, which is basically about making assumptions. So we're back to this thing about trying to be explicit rather than making assumptions. The use of the cooperative learning approach, which, as I've said, has been found to be very useful, and the accommodation of different communication styles. So those are the things which I think have value. I don't have a recipe for transferring them. These are initial thoughts. And I think they would have value in the intercultural training room. And I don't know if you agree. Unconscious bias. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to try and prepare trainers / teachers, then this is one of the things that would be in the training about unconscious bias. And I think that people tend to get upset if they are told that they are biased, or that they might very well be biased. So I think that it's this is one reason I think why Zaretta Hammond goes in for the neuroscience, because what she says is that everybody is biased and you can't not be biased. So I think that if you present it in that way, it's about framing. If you present it in that way, and then you try and train people a little in how they're being biased, I think it's easier to accept. It's easier to accept that everybody's biased rather than thinking, oh, I'm particularly biased and I'm being picked out for that. So from 2010, and then the book, which is mainly for, you must appreciate it is addressed to school children, but I found a lot of it very useful, by Hammond, The Culturally Responsive Teaching. And then the Wlodkowski framework. Are you able to hear me at the moment? That's actually a very good sign, because it's a sign for me to stop and to ask for comments and to see if there are any questions. You have been asking me questions in the chat as I've been going along, but I'm just wondering, what I have a question for you. Can you see any application for some of the things that I've been talking about in your own training? That's my question to you. Or have you got any examples, for example, of different styles of communication? So if you can use the chat, that would be great. We haven't worked out a way to hear you, so it'll have to be through the text chat. Maybe I should write my questions. Okay, a poll has come up, which is about the webinar as a whole. So you could fill that in. So there are 7 questions. I'm just writing. While you're filling in the poll, I'm just writing the questions. My questions as against the general questions. So Corinne asked, what pedagogy do I recommend for culturally responsive teaching? I think it has to be a fairly democratic. It's more in terms of facilitation than being too didactic, if everybody is to feel included. The culturally responsive teaching, when you read the literature, it is very much based on what happens in school. One of the critical differences, I would say, is that if you're a school class teacher, you will have a long time to get to know your students, and that helps. Whereas I think that as intercultural trainers, you get a very short time to get to know the people in your group, very short time to actually build a relationship with them. And I think that might be a disadvantage. So we need shortcuts, basically, for that, because you don't have the luxury that a school teacher has of knowing that you're going to be with these people for 9 months. Has it been applied in higher education? That is a very interesting question, which I don't know the answer to that. I know that, for example, in the UK, universities are trying to be more inclusive, trying to accommodate working class people more, and trying to make it easier for people to work and study at the same time, not make assumptions about how much time people have to devote to their studies, but I don't know how far it goes. Yeah, oh, even a 4 or 5 day training is unusual nowadays. So you have very short time to get to know the people that you're working with. I think that's the main stumbling block, actually, with all this, that it's about getting to know your group and responding to them based on the knowledge that you have. So the shorter time you have, the less possible it is. Do we ever have enough time to get them to realize common values? Yeah, it's a tough one. I'm throwing you a challenge. I wonder how I can follow this up, because Tony van der Vem is asking me a question. Have I got more information on higher education application of CRT? And if I were to find this out, how could I get in contact? Letter, okay. Later. Yeah, but would it be the LinkedIn SIETAR group, for example? Yes.
We also have another question by Tarwania Demfield that's asking, what about the format of the presentation? Are the toolboxes labeled as such so we can choose one, or are you suggesting all are incorporated together in this order?
I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused. Are we talking about the quick poll or are we talking about my PowerPoint?
Okay.
I'm a bit confused.
I don't know, was a Q&A that arrived by Tanya Genfield. I don't know if you can see it. Click on Q&A.
There are several LinkedIn groups, SIETAR LinkedIn groups. There is at least one which, yeah, I'm a member of 2 SIETAR LinkedIn groups. Yes, PowerPoint slides, I'm very happy to share them. I just don't know where. My first inclination would be to share them. You're closing the small SIETAR LinkedIn group. Oh, right. That's a disappointment. Okay, well, Maura has my PowerPoint slides, so if Maura has your information, then I suppose it could be done that way.
Okay, okay. Yes, and then
Yeah.
the video recording anyway of the webinar will be online soon.
True, yes.
With the PowerPoint as well.
Okay. Right, and yes, my final slide is just where you can find me, which is the podcast. So if anybody has an interesting story to tell, you're very welcome to get in touch with me because we are always looking for new stories for the podcast. And I have started a teaching culture newsletter, and actually some of the questions that you've put in there, some of the topics will find themselves in the teaching culture newsletter. As I say, my website is not operational at the moment, but I am on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. And if you search on Foxstone UK, you will find me. I'm afraid I have to ask for an explanation of what IRC is before I can answer the question of whether I use a measuring tool like IRC. Oh, I see, right. Actually, no, but you've given me an idea, so I will follow that up. That sounds like, would that be intercultural readiness for the trainer or for the trainees? To measure the trainees. That might be a good starting point. That might be an excellent starting point, depending on what it looks like for getting those common shared values out. Hopefully there will be shared values. Okay. I'm trying to read the questions and say what my response is as I'm seeing them. I will stop sharing, I think, now. So we're back to just the webcams. If you bring your cursor to the bottom of the screen, you can see something called chat, and that's what I'm responding to. Yeah, and Maura is asking you to answer the poll, which popped up on your screens about 4 minutes ago. It's about 7 questions about the webinar. Trialogue. That's nothing to do with Björn Zekelund, is it? Björn, yes. Yeah, that's excellent. That is excellent. Okay, so you've given me a few ideas about how to make more links and make this more useful to the training context as against the school context. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and I hope that I can follow up, and please nag me if I have forgotten something. But certainly I will do my best. Thank you so much, Maura, for keeping me on track.
Thank you. So everything will be online soon. You will receive an email anywhere with the video recording link. And SIETAR Europa will provide you also the slides. Thank you again, Anna, for your knowledge and for your webinar. Bye.
Thank you. I'm going to collect the text chat to see if I need to follow up anything.
Yeah.